Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 12.5. We immediately need to address the elephant in the room, the B patch. Generally, B patches are smaller and are meant to nudge outliers in the meta towards a healthier state of balance. 12.5 B patch, on the other hand, has a ton of nerfs, like almost a normal patch worth of changes. Due to that, our trait tier list is highly speculative. We'll do our best with speculating, but take this list with a grain of salt because the meta is going to change. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off, we have the S tier synergy, which consists of Mercenary, Mastermind, Enchanter, and Socialite. We're being cautious on which traits we put into this tier because what will end up on the top is still yet to be seen. As such, we're going with the traits that we see as the most likely to have a high play rate. At the top of the S tier, we have Mercenaries. Mercenaries doing well in the meta are always dependent on how easily the player can cash out. With several nerfs across the board, particularly to early game reroll boards that often hit fast power spikes, the value of Mercenaries is likely to go up. It's also quite easy to cash out with Mercenary since Gangplank and Misfortune were untouched in the B-patch nerfs. Put all of the changes and lack of changes together, and the best opening board by far is probably going to be a loss streak with Mercs. Despite previous nerfs still lowering his value, Silco with Mastermind is still the all-around best solo champion in the game. By solo, we mean you can toss him into a composition and gain value regardless of whether or not Scholar is active. Mastermind just enables a lot of champions effectively, and Silco himself can win rounds thanks to his ability. That said, it can still be a risk to run Silco, so had the B patch not occurred, we most likely would have seen him down in the A tier and not S. Two of the most common traits are still Enchanter and Socialite. Both of these synergies provide some type of utility that benefits the team. It's worth noting that both Senna and Morgana were nerfed, so the Senna carry compositions may fall off a bit, but playing Enchanter for the trait is likely still going to be common, especially with Orianna untouched. All in all, if you want a reliable splash trait, either Enchanter or Socialite are usually the first to consider. Let's continue on to where the bulk of the synergies in the meta are, in the A tier. This tier consists of Bodyguard, Clockwork, Twinshot, Rival, Transformer, Innovator, Striker, Scholar, and Syndicate. First off, a lot has changed with the B patch, so A and B tier are where the bulk of the speculation on the meta is. For the A tier specifically, these synergies are what we consider the meta, as they are the most consistently used in compositions that place in the top 4. Up first, we have Bodyguard. Bodyguard took the place of Bruisers in the initial meta of 12.5, and despite some changes in the B patch, it's likely they remain the best frontline. This is mainly because both Leona and Braum were unchanged, though it's worth noting that Debonair and Syndicate took a major hit in the B patch nerfs. We do expect to see more of an evening out in terms of viable frontlines, but Bodyguard should remain the most consistent. Clockwork wasn't able to escape the nerfs, but honestly it was barely a scratch because the only thing they targeted was the 4 Clockwork attack speed increase. Of course, plenty of compositions that utilize Clockwork have been nerfed, but neither Orianna nor Jhin were touched by those changes. That means Orianna is the best utility for cost, and by proxy, Jhin remains the best secondary damage dealer since those two are almost always paired together. The surprise at 12.5 was how dominant Twinshot ended up being. This was due to a round of buffs to multiple Twinshot champions, as well as the fact that there are 4 viable carries within the trait. Both Lucian and Corki have been nerfed in the B patch, which lowers Twinshot from S down to A tier. We're still expecting to see Twinshot remain a viable composition, especially because of Gangplank and Jinx, but it should end up being less flexible than before. Interestingly, Jinx was untouched in the B patch, which is why Rival remains so high up in the tier list. Vi did fall off a bit with Bruisers being less common in the meta, but Jinx being such a strong late game damage dealer is all that really matters for the trait. Perhaps with Lucian, Corki, and Scrap being nerfed, it will have an impact on the viability of Jinx, but in terms of carry potential, Jinx is still up there as one of the best 5-cost champions. Even though Innovators were nerfed, Jace with Transformer was not. That said, Jace is relying on Innovators doing well to remain relevant in the meta. Or is he? Jace provides utility in the backline in the form of the attack speed buff, as well as a lot of damage, plus he can frontline effectively in melee form. Being such a versatile champion means he's more likely to persevere through the B patch changes and continue to be a staple of the late game. Speaking of, let's talk about Innovators. Innovators as a trait has been nerfed countless times, and guess what? It's still good. And we predict it will still be good as the 12.5B meta settles. But we should point out that late game Innovators took a big hit, meaning this synergy may only be worth playing in the early stages of the game. We'll have to wait and see what happens with Innovators, but it's by far the most resilient synergy of the set. Next is a bit of speculation on our end, as Striker did receive a buff with slightly increased bonus AD, as well as Sivir doing more bounce damage with her ability. Rek'Sai was also buffed, that's unlikely to be too relevant, and mostly balances out the nerf to Aurelia. It's hard to say whether Sivir will become a viable carry, but with tons of other compositions and champions being nerfed, now is the best time for her to rise up in the meta. Scholar is a useful synergy, though nowhere near as effective in utility compared to Enchanter and Socialite. With nerfs to Renata, Silco, and now both Syndra and Zyra, the value of the synergy goes down a lot. That said, all of those units are still capable of doing well and should remain core to the meta in various ways, which is why we're keeping Scholar in the A tier. One of the synergies with the most nerfs is Syndicate. Syndicate had a lot of staying power in the meta between Ashe Reroll, Zyra, and Ahri. In addition to that, Morgana was also a staple for a lot of boards. But all those champions have been nerfed, including the synergy itself. Normally with so many nerfs, we'd basically toss Syndicate into the garbage and call it a day, but it was such a strong synergy before the B patch that we're playing it safe. Safe as in putting it at the bottom of the A tier. We may turn out to be wrong and Syndicate is literally the worst next to Yordle Lord, but we don't expect to see it completely disappear from the meta. With that, we can continue onto the B tier traits. This tier consists of Mutant, Debonair, Scrap, Assassin, Sniper, Bruiser, Chemtech, Glutton, Enforcer, and Hextech. These are the rest of the meta synergies, though most of them are less consistent or more niche than those in the A tier. That said, they still play an important role in the meta. At the top, we have Mutant. Mutant is the hardest synergy to place because depending on the mutation, it's either S tier or C tier. For example, if it's Synaptic Web and you hit Malzahar 3, your chances of winning go up dramatically. Mutant also benefits a lot from having an emblem to give to other units. Basically, there's a lot of variables to consider with this synergy, so averaging them all out leaves it at the top of the B tier. It's worth noting that no mutants were nerfed and both Rek'Sai and Kai'Sa received buffs, which does further increase the value of mutants in the meta. Like Syndicate's Debonair took a huge hit in the B patch, with the trait itself being nerfed alongside Draven, Talon, Syndra, and Brand. The exact numbers aren't too drastic, but when you stack nerf after nerf on one synergy, well, the value of it goes down significantly. By far the most impactful nerf is to Talon, as Talon reroll was dominating a large portion of the meta. On the plus side, Draven wasn't too reliant on Debonair, and Zeri wasn't nerfed, giving Debonair hope at remaining relevant. The only thing we're mostly sure of is that Talon reroll will no longer be as consistent and is likely to end up as a high roll only composition. Overall, Scrap was the least changed with the exception of Aurelia. Aurelia nerfs do hurt the viability of mid to late game Scrap boards, but for the most part, a full Scrap composition wasn't too common. For the most part, Scrap is all about stage 2 and 3 and is essentially a splash trait beyond that. It means the value of Scrap is about the same as before, with priority going slightly down because of the nerf to Aurelia. Talon and Twitch being nerfed has lowered the strength of Assassin by a lot. Before it would have easily been at the top of the A tier, now it's below average B tier synergy. What saves it from being even lower than that is both Twitch and Talon should remain viable in the meta, albeit less potent. But it's also quite possible neither of those compositions do well moving forward, and if that's the case, the Assassin stock will crash super hard. Sniper is always hard to judge on how effective it really is outside of specific augments like Sniper's Nest. Ashe was a large reason as to why Sniper had such a huge impact in the meta, and with her being nerfed, that means Sniper goes back to being a bit below average in usage. It's still a nice damage boost if you're running Snipers, but it's not essential to any comp. Bruisers may be lacking compared to Bodyguards, but they are still a common frontline in the meta, specifically during the early stages of the game. We don't have much to say about them other than they're going to do well until the late game, where other frontlines outscale them. Similarly, Chemtech has the same issues because of the Renata nerfs. In the mid-game, Chemtech is amazing, but as the game goes on, it scales poorly. Twitch being nerfed also doesn't help, and why Chemtech got pushed further down the list than it otherwise would have been. It is worth noting Victor was untouched and has the potential to carry the synergy. Glutton is in the same position as Bruisers, though it's more nuanced. If you hit Tom Kench early into stage 4, you're in an amazing position. Find him too late, especially from stage 5 and on, and then his value goes down dramatically. This is odd for a 5 cost. This is the main reason we have Glutton so low on the tier list. With Bruisers being less commonplace in the meta, Enforcer has nosedived into obscurity simply because it's much harder to splash the trade in. If either Hextech or Bruiser return to the forefront of the meta, Enforcer will join them because of Sejuani. As it stands for now, Enforcer has amazing utility, but being unable to easily splash it in lowers its viability considerably. And the final B tier trait is Hextech. Hextech still remains effective in the early game since a lot of the champions are low cost, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot going on for this trait. The potential saving grace are the buffs to Sivir, but even then it's more likely to affect Striker and not Hextech. On now to the final section, the C tier synergies. This tier consists of Arcanist, Challenger, Yordles, Colossus, and Yordle Lord. These are the bottom of the meta traits, some of which got hit hard, by the B-patch nerfs. One such trait is Arcanist. Arcanist was already a somewhat niche composition, and with several champions nerfed, it's even less viable than before. That said, Malzahar and Victor were left alone in the patch and may be capable of carrying the synergy. Challenger, quite frankly, has no use in the current meta. Sure, it's useful in some cases, but no champion or composition builds around the Challenger trait. Until Tryndamere becomes more viable or Draven needs more than 2 of the traits, it's unlikely we'll see Challenger to do well in the meta. Yordle took a lot of hits, but the largest by far was the augment so small. With Gnar, Corki, and Vex nerfed as well, the synergy is more than likely only relevant in Stage 2 for a bit of extra gold, and even then, it's overshadowed by Mercenary. Unfortunately, there's just no reason to play 2 Colossus champions on the same board. Cho'Gath can be strong, especially with a good mutation, but Alistar just isn't played too often, and Galio is almost non-existent. Until every Colossus champion has a place, it's unlikely Colossus will gain much value in the meta. And finally, as always, Yordle Lord is at the very bottom, and with the Yordle nerfs, this is even less of a reason to play Veigar. Don't bother trying to go for this trait unless you're super high-rolling Yordles or playing for fun. That's all we have for today's tier list video. Again, we want to reiterate that a lot of this list has been speculative based on the B-patch notes. Luckily, this patch is a long one, so the meta has plenty of time to settle. Let us know in the comment section below what traits you think will do well after the B-patch. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy our content, be sure to like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.